Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. When the fleet of Barbary pirate vessels left the harbor of Algiers in late 1609, things didn't look great for the Barbary pirates. At least, they looked bad for this particular brand of European Barbary pirates. John Ward, Simon Danziker, Sir Francis Verney, Bill Graves, Richard Bishop, Big Pete, and all of the captains with famous names, well, they all had decisions to make. Recently, Barbary had become a lot less friendly toward the pirates than it once had been. Now, Barbary had long had a culture of corsairs and privateers, dating back to 1492 at the least, and the brothers Barbarossa. Under Suleiman the Magnificent, alongside whom the brothers Barbarossa fought, the Ottoman Empire grew into an up-and-coming world-class power. They always had big, expansive land armies, hence the whole, sacking Constantinople thing. But to be a real world-class power in the 16th century meant sea power. So alongside Queen Elizabeth in England and the Netherlands under William the Silent, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman employed those corsair privateers to serve as a navy. And Barbarossa and Suleiman did quite well. But when they died, their heirs were unable to keep up with the European innovations at sea. Now, there were a large number of capable and talented sea commanders that followed Barbarossa. Dragut and Murat Rais, for example, and they did well for a time, but the superior European round ships were just better than their galleys. So, once Europe was at peace after the Anglo-Spanish War and when the 80 Years' War went on hiatus, the leaders of Algiers and Tunis especially were happy to welcome in European privateers. They brought with them shipwrights and pilots and navigators and gunnery experts, and those specialists used their knowledge to enrich themselves as well as to provide protection for those Barbary city-states. But they also taught the locals how to do all those jobs. They trained up the Barbary Corsairs in every aspect of the modern maritime craft. And then the Barbary pirates, the European Barbary pirates, started causing a ruckus in the Mediterranean. They started agitating the crowned heads of Europe. The Ottomans were at war in Eastern Europe, as they almost always were. They were at a semblance of war in the Indian Ocean. More on that later. But Barbary had been relatively peaceful ever since the Battle of Lepanto. The Mediterranean, as far as the Ottomans were concerned, was not an active front. It had been so for about 40 years. But now, Venice and Spain especially were poking their noses around. They were blockading ports as they had in Algiers, and it became clear that they were thinking about new and exciting conquests in Barbary. Since the pirates had taught the Barbary locals everything they knew, they were no longer useful, and they were becoming something of a lodestone around the necks of the Barbary leaders. Now, Tripoli had never had a huge presence of European pirates, but both Tunis and Algiers kicked all of theirs out, for a while. The biggest problem here, it's always a problem not to have a home base, but even more pressing for Ward and Danziker and their lot was the presence of Spanish and Venetian and Dutch and French fleets patrolling the Mediterranean. They were out there right now on the hunt for these pirates. No, I don't know that any of the pirates knew anything about the French fleet or anything about the English squadron that was still waiting outside the Strait of Gibraltar, but they were there. But they did know about the Venetians and the Spanish, so what were these pirates to do? Well, after leaving Algiers, they just decided to leave entirely. The fleets under all the pirates that we just mentioned they dispersed after the battle with the Spanish fleet in Algiers harbor. They were too large to avoid notice if they stayed together, but all of them agreed to meet up in Morocco. And thus began what will prove to be the beginning of the end of what is at least our version of the history of Barbary piracy. This is episode 97, AfterWard. There are a couple of things I'd like to note here. First, about the title. I lifted it whole cloth from Greg Bach's book, Barbary Pirate, The Life and Crimes of John Ward. I'm not clever enough to come up with something like that on my own, and yeah, I know it makes a bit more sense when it's in an actual afterword, in a book, in text, and not a podcast episode, but I really liked it, and since it's from a book about pirates and this is a show about pirates, I think a little theft is to be expected. And second, this is technically our 100th episode. We've had 3 unnumbered special episodes in the past, so this is the 100th episode I've put out. And that's crazy to me for a few reasons. When I first came up with the plan to do this show, I originally intended for it to be brief. I thought that there would be a few episodes of background, a few on Francis Drake, and then a little time on Henry Morgan and the Buccaneers, then immediately on to Henry Avery, and finally the real meat of the story, the Pirates of Nassau. Now that didn't happen. First of all, because the deeper I delve into pirates, the more stories I find that I want to share with you. But then there's just the fact that I'm not that capable about being that brief about anything. When it comes to the Barbary pirates, for example, I've been talking about them for several months, and they were meant to be just a brief diversion, a sort of a palate cleanser for a few weeks. If you were to take a look at my outline, well, I outlined 2 episodes for talking about John Ward, and I think maybe 3 about the Barbarossas. And I've done significantly more than that about both of those characters. I also never expected to get this far into this podcast because when I started it, I never expected the warm reception and response that I've wound up receiving from all of you. I thought it would be a fun hobby, a way for me to talk about the things that I find interesting about pirates and piracy, and that maybe somebody out there would find that interesting as well. But it's turned into more than that. It's something that I cherish being able to do, and I'm constantly grateful to everyone who gives me the opportunity to do it. But we're not going to be doing any special 100th episode stuff today. We'll save that for the official episode 100 in a couple of weeks. I just wanted to take a moment to say thanks. Also, despite the title, we're not actually going to talk much about John Ward today. We've already discussed his last, mostly peaceful years and eventual death. In many ways, his adventures, even though he's present here, are largely over. He'll go back out to sea a couple of times, but not to any great effect. This is his last major endeavor, and while he was still a big name, a famous pirate, he really played second fiddle to Simon Danziker, and in a lot of ways even more so to those that would follow, those who would come afterward, if you will. If you want a more in-depth and nuanced look at Jack Ward, I really suggest Mr. Bach's book. It's the most readable and interesting modern history about Ward that I've found. And if you'd like the larger story of the Barbary pirates told, I certainly suggest Adrian Tenniswood's book, Pirates of Barbary. But for now, back to the story of the pirates fleeing Algiers in the Mediterranean. On this voyage, it was the Dutch running the show. The most prominent among them was, of course, Simon Danziker, but only for now. Remember, he was one of the few pirates who was still somewhat welcome in Barbary. Redwan Pasha had kicked all of the pirates out of Algiers at the end of the blockade. The blockade was damaging to the economy, and the pirates themselves caused a lot of problems. But it was understood that Danziker and his fleet were welcome back any time, as long as they brought some goods back with them. A little something to contribute to Algiers and to mitigate some of the damage done by the blockade. But, well, it seems that Danziker may have been of a different mind about Barbary than the rest of the pirates at this point. If he was, though, he was, at least for now, keeping that to himself. More than a few of the pirates had followed John Ward's lead in leaving Christianity behind in favor of Islam. While we did question John Ward's motives and maybe even suggest certain practical, mercenary reasons for doing so, that's not a brush that we can use to paint all the pirates. Many of them probably did convert for similar mercenary reasons, but many of them were legitimate conversions of faith. And then I think it's important to remember that the world in 1608 was a lot different than our world today. Religion was much more closely tied to every culture in the world than it is in our modern society. For many of the pirates, for many people who immigrated to other cultures, conversion, in this case to Islam, was, in a way, just a part of the process of joining another society. Today, when we move a significant distance, we'll probably need to get a new ID and maybe find a new bank and a library card. And then, if you are a person of faith, you might look for the right community for you. But back then, conversion was probably more important than anything else. Joining the congregation was part of joining your community. Do you want to get married or own property or be properly handled upon your death? Well, you'd better have a church to which you belong, or, a synagogue or a mosque. So even those who weren't just practical mercenaries trying to get ahead in their society, even those that weren't legitimate conversions of faith, nearly all of the pirates converted to Islam, and that's why there was so much concern over Christians becoming renegados. But Simon Danziker, in this as in so many other things, was an enigma. He didn't convert like Jack Ward. He didn't convert like most of his own followers. He decided to stay, if not a faithful Christian, at least relatively unaffiliated. And that may explain something of the actions that were to come on the part of Simon Danziker. Now, after leaving Algiers on their way to Morocco, a few pirates were intercepted or captured by one or another of the fleets that were out patrolling. But by and large, everyone made it to their destination. Now, it was a difficult road. They stayed mostly close to shore, which was where most of the patrols were, and then they actually went through the strait to reach the Atlantic, and those were even more heavily patrolled. But still, these were skilled smugglers and pirates, so nearly everyone made it. Well, probably. See, it's possible that two names who we know didn't make it at all. Simon Danziker and Sir Francis Verney. Around this time, their path is going to diverge from the other pirates, and it's entirely possible that those two, along with their closest associates, didn't even go to Morocco. So Francis Verney and Simon Danziker may have been at Morocco. They may have been involved in some of the decisions that would be made there. But we're going to operate off the assumption that they didn't, because we're talking about that next time. And even if they were, they weren't a major factor in it because they left. At about the time the forces of Morocco realized that there were hundreds of pirates in their midst, Simon Danziker and Francis Verney were already back on the prowl. Now, what ships they captured out there are lost to history. But right about this time, Simon Danziker very much isn't. He begins popping up in official records from England and France and Italy. Now, he was always prominent in records from the Netherlands, but this was different. Instead of, as was usually the case, playing second fiddle to Ward, Simon Danziker was front and center in all of this foreign correspondence. And it wasn't some great act of piracy. As I said, there were no notable captures around this time, but it was all due to a request on the part of Simon Danziker for a pardon. Not some official, state-sanctioned, notarized, signed, and sealed request, just rumors. But they were popping up everywhere, all of a sudden, so it looks very much like Simon Danziker managed, after he left the other pirates behind, to get word to one of his agents operating in Europe, and they were able to slip word to the right people that Danziker wanted to return. And there was a fair amount of interest in granting that pardon. Say you were a king, and you removed a dangerous pirate from the high seas. Well, that's a decent feather for your cap. It was a bit of a gamble. The ex-pirate would become your responsibility after the pardon, and if they returned to piracy, you might easily lose more than you had gained. But then there were other reasons that one might want to pardon a notorious pirate. There were obviously going to be stipulations in the pardon. A hefty fine was implied, but then there was the possibility that someone like Simon Danziker would work for you. In much the same way that he'd served the Pasha of Algiers, Simon Danziker could be employed by whomever happened to pardon him in the modernization of local fleets and shipyards. A provision could be included that he would be a free man after his fine was paid, but he would be required to provide certain services as the government saw fit. These would be expected to be oversight of the local fleet, At least that's what they would imply. Now, England and the Netherlands weren't terribly keen on the idea. James I had something of a bad taste in his mouth when it came to pardoning pirates after the whole debacle with Ward, and the Netherlands didn't really want their most notorious native son back in their country. That might look bad. Plus, they didn't really have a need of someone to modernize their navies. They were quickly building two of the most proficient navies in the world. But France and Italy, on the other hand, they did have a need of someone like Danziker to teach their shipwrights and their sailors. Now, we don't know who may have offered a pardon to Simon Danziker, except that France, at least, did get word to him. They agreed to grant Simon Danziker pardon and allow him back to what had once been his home city, the southern French city of Marseille. That pardon would have the stipulations I already mentioned, but Danziker, in order for the pardon to take place, would have to do one other thing. He would have to prove that he was a man of his word. He was expected to do something grandiose to show the king and the council there in France that he really was sincere in his desire to leave Barbary behind and become a French citizen. We know that they got these messages to Danziker because, well, that's what he did. It's unclear if Simon Danziker told Sir Francis Verney anything about any of this on their way back to Algiers. There's plenty of reasons that any respectable pirate might want to stop on the coast of France, and Sir Francis Verney probably wouldn't have suspected that the reasons included pardon. It looks like Verney didn't know anything. Perhaps Danziker didn't think that he could trust this quite recent and by all accounts very devout convert to Islam. If Sir Francis was in on what was about to happen, he very prudently kept his mouth shut. So both of the pirates, along with their closest associates, returned to Algiers. Presumably, they brought a decent haul with them to be allowed back in. They were greeted as returning heroes and close friends. They were feted and feasted and pampered by the Pasha. And Danziker the entire time played the part of the loyal admiral and close friend of Redouan. And nothing in that was suspicious in the very least. He was a returning hero, he had been many times before, and he was an admiral and close friend of the Pasha. But while these festivities were going on, Simon Danziker's men got into position. In the very small hours of the morning, on one day in August 1609, Simon Danziker and his men, they made their move. They knew that they were going to leave Barbary, and if they were going to do so, they would need men, Christian men, to help them sail. They had crews on their ships, but they were mostly Muslim, and those Muslim corsairs certainly wouldn't help them leave Barbary forever. So the men who had gotten themselves into position during the feast, they attacked a slave barracks there in Algiers. They did so quietly, this wasn't a frontal assault, but they killed all of the guards and they captured the slave masters inside. Then they set the European slaves free. Now this may have been, in many ways, an act of conscience on the part of Simon Danziker. He may have felt extreme guilt over having been a party to capturing so many of his fellow Europeans. But it was also practical. Among those slaves, most of them had some seafaring experience. Most of the slaves captured by all of the pirates were, sailors. That's where they captured them. And when they happened to come across women or children, they were usually sold off very fast to families who had need of them in some sort of domestic role. But most of the sailors that were captured were kept in these sorts of barracks to act as galley slaves. If they were not going to be galley slaves, many of them were used as farm labor, and they were sort of rented out. They were able to get a fair number of decent sailors and fold them into the crew of Simon Danziker's ship. Now, all of the rest of the slaves that were in these barracks were set free as well, which means that at least several hundred, perhaps more than 1,000 slaves were right here, set free. Now, those other freed slaves, those who were not going to be part of Danziker's crew, well, Danziker didn't just set them free and let them go about their business. No, He gave them weapons, and he told them to follow him to the harbor. They wouldn't necessarily be a part of his crew, but they would be able to find their own ships and sail away to safety. Again, there is a practical reason for this. Remember that grandiose gesture? Freeing 1,000 or more Christian slaves doesn't mean much if they all get recaptured as soon as you leave. He wanted to ensure that they would make it back to Europe with him. Now, this exodus of escaped slaves did attract notice in Algiers. They had to fight their way through several units of guards that tried to stop them, and then the dockmen, and they killed everyone who got in their way. And there were certainly plenty of Muslim corsairs and regular soldiers there in Algiers to stop them, but in the wee hours of the morning, when everyone was sleeping, the pirates were able to get through with only a few small skirmishes, for which their superior numbers meant they won every time. And as we know, pirates, those who were leading this charge, are very good at ending fights quietly. That's part of the job description. But when they made it to the harbor, there was another fight in store. Now, Danziker and his men went first. They were well known, and they made it to Danziker's ship with no cause for alarm. Why would any of the Muslim crew on board be concerned about their captain showing up? So they were captured with ease. And from the deck of his ship, Danziker was able to delegate duties out to the rest of his primary crew to ensure that everyone else made it to safety. He had a few of his top officers, 5 or 6 of them, along with some of the most hardened killers among his crew, leading the rest of the slaves toward the ships that they would be capturing. Remember, most of these slaves were one-time sailors and certainly knew quite a bit about fighting on deck, but they weren't pirates. This was a little bit out of their wheelhouse, but with the proper leadership and a few men to steel their backbone, they were able to sneak aboard ships that had already been agreed upon earlier in the day, perhaps the day before, kill the crew entirely, and take their ship for themselves. They took the 5 or 6 best ships in the harbor, and remember, these were ships that Danziker had personally overseen the construction of. He'd probably designed elements of them himself. He knew which ships to take, and his men knew how to sail them expertly. They left probably hundreds of dead Algerians in their wake, guards, slave masters, soldiers, sailors, and other corsairs. But there was one last step in this master plan, in this grandiose gesture. Any ship that Danziker thought was worthy enough or fast enough to chase them down once they left was bombarded with oil and tar and hay, and then set alight. As the 6 or so pirate ships, led by Danziker and crewed by freed slaves, left the harbor of Algiers, the entire fleet, at least anything of any quality, was left burning behind them. The next action of Simon Danziker does actually kind of make me question exactly when he learned that France and Marseille offered to take him in. Instead of traveling north to travel up the coast of Italy to get to France, he traveled west along the coast of Africa. Now, this may once again just be practicality. Anybody who decided to chase him would probably go north. That's where he was most likely going, rather than to other Islamic lands. And what makes that so strange to me is, well, if he wasn't required by the stipulations of this agreement to commit this grand gesture to prove his sincerity, then why did he attack Algiers? Was it simply to escape with enough men to sail on his ship? Was it, in fact, that lingering hint of guilt that he felt, and a desire to release these slaves before leaving, many of whom he may have captured personally? I don't know the answer to that question, but keep it in mind. But if he did, in fact, know about this stipulation, if it did, in fact, exist, then he may have thought that even 1,000 Christian slaves wasn't a grand enough gesture for the King of France. Perhaps he thought that they required something more of him, something taken from one of their other enemies. This newly formed pirate fleet under Danziker sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and once out into the open ocean, almost immediately, they happened upon a Spanish treasure fleet, headed back from the New World. Now, this wasn't the sort of treasure fleet that you might picture, the sort complete with 12 treasure ships and guarded by galleons. Those wouldn't be seen for decades yet, into the time of Morgan or even beyond. This fleet was perhaps only about a half a dozen ships, with one of them a treasure galleon. The other ships in the fleet would have been gunboats or other smaller ships, perhaps proto-frigates intended to guard the galleon. And in 1609, that would have been a threat. That would have been a powerful force. Even Danziker's own custom-built private pirate fleet would have been a bit wary. But it was still a serious find. This was a treasure galleon, and honestly, in any era of piracy, it would be a windfall, the likes of which most pirates would only dream. And most pirates, even later on, would be unable to capture a fleet like this. A few could, of course. Blackbeard in his frigate, or Bartholomew Roberts, Henry Avery, certainly, Henry Morgan, maybe, and absolutely Ching Shi, but only a handful of pirates would be able to take this on. But right here, Danziker proved his mettle, and proved that he deserves a place alongside those other greatest pirates. Now, most of the men in Danziker's fleet were escaped slaves, and they'd only been freed from their imprisonment for a few days, and those had been days hard at sea, working to escape as fast as possible. If this came down to an actual fight at sea, well, less than a third, maybe less than a quarter of Danziker's men were actually in fighting shape. But remember, Danziker was the devil captain, Dali Rais, and he was that bigger-than-life, theatrical pirate. And that's what puts him in that category with men like Blackbeard and Henry Morgan. Gunboats are fast and nimble and well-armed, and galleons were, of course, the powerhouse ships of the day. But when they found themselves suddenly surrounded by half a dozen pirate vessels and a Dutch frigate led by a man who was famous the world over for his grand acts of piracy boldly sails up to the galleon, well, a fight seems like a really bad idea. That's the sort of act that only a man who was assured of victory and who had proven his ability to find it time and time again, that's the sort of action a man like that would take. The Spanish at least believed this to be true, and they surrendered without a fight. The Venetian ambassador to Madrid wrote back to the Doge and Senate of Venice, quote, "500,000 of gold in booty was taken, and that, one may say, in the very harbor of Seville." End quote. Now, in 1609, the gold mines in Central and South America were still producing gold, but there had been a century of extracting as much gold from the Americas as possible. So it wouldn't have been a ship filled with gold and pearls. There would have been a little bit of that on board, but mostly it probably would have been silver and probably indigo to top that off, along with a good amount of sugar as well. But still, that's all very valuable. Valuable to the tune of 500,000 gold pieces. And that is a significant haul for any pirate. Now, the ambassador may have been exaggerating, or maybe not. But now Danziker had 500,000 in booty, along with several hundred recently freed Christian slaves, perhaps as many as 200 Muslim corsairs prisoner on board his ships, and he was now sailing at the head of a fleet that numbered perhaps as many as 12 ships. Danziker's own frigate, along with the Spanish galleon, and the best ships from among those he had captured from both Algiers and this treasure fleet. With all of the freed slaves that he had with him, he may have had enough sailors to take the entire treasure fleet with him. And with that in his possession, Danziker returned home to southern France, to Marseille. Now that was actually his home. You might recall that after his career as a privateer for the Dutch came to an end, Simon Danziker moved to Marseille, where he married the local governor's daughter. A quarrel with his father-in-law, the governor, and the magistrates sent him away from Marseille to the Mediterranean and to Barbary, but before that quarrel took place, Simon Danziker did take the time to start a family before he was chased off. Now, this might be a case of a well-respected Dutch privateer in good standing moving to southern France, where he fell deeply in love with a young maiden. She was the governor's daughter, and he wooed her through proper courtship, though he did quarrel with his father-in-law, as young men are wont to do, and was eventually chased off. Or This might be the case of a young Dutch rapscallion and sometimes pirate fleeing the law in the rest of France, which he was doing, and making his way in secret to Marseille. Then, when he met the governor's daughter, this charming, handsome young pirate seduced her, got her with child, then was forced to marry her as would only be proper, and then chased off by the local governor, who happened to be the father of his bride. You can almost picture the governor realizing his daughter was with child, realizing that this Dutch pirate was responsible for this, not wanting a scandal or to have a bastard for her grandson, so insisting that they get married perhaps at the point of a pike, and then, once everything was in order and nobody would look at him scornfully, chasing this pirate off, never expecting him to return. Personally, that's the story that I prefer. Either way, Danziker did have a wife and a young son waiting for him in Marseille. But I can only imagine that homecoming. He was probably overjoyed to see his wife and son. He'd been away for a little over 2 years now, and we can presume that the feeling was returned. But what about the father-in-law? The man who chased you off 2 years earlier, who was probably waiting alongside his daughter, your wife, and your son, his grandson, and he just happens to be the governor of the province, and you just happen to be a pirate, and not just any pirate, but one of the most famous pirates in the world. That's not an ideal situation. But then Simon Danziker did have a few points in his favor here. First, he was in possession of a piece of paper signed by the king, saying that he was now allowed to be here in Marseille, regardless of what the local lord or the magistrate or his father-in-law thought about it. That's hard to argue with. And this wasn't just some random French king. This was Henry IV. This was the first Bourbon king of France, so kind of a big deal. And then there's the fact that Simon Danziker, coming back to Marseille, was probably the richest man in town. Maybe the local duke had more money, maybe. But even if he did, he lived on his estate, his castle, outside of town. And even if he did, Danziker was still number 2. Now, that might have changed his status as the richest man in town after his fine was paid. But the local merchants there in town, and all of the officials who just had their pockets filled and their budgets made fat, well, they were certainly aware of the boon to the economy that Simon Danziker and all of his men brought with them. And then, in addition to the royal writ and the chests upon chests full of treasure, Danziker brought with him what was among the most powerful navies in southern France. Here's 6 frigates, 5 or 6 gunships, and a Spanish galleon. Now, Marseille did have a coast guard of sorts, but nothing to compare with this. Now, Danziker himself wasn't personally allowed to keep any but his primary vessel, but they were incorporated into the fleet of Marseille, which became significantly stronger. So again, as he may have not been the richest man in town, everyone knew what he had done for them, and he may no longer have personally had the most powerful fleet in southern France, but everyone knew who brought that fleet to them. And there were regulations placed upon Danziker and his ability to sail. He was still the owner of his ship, but he wasn't exactly the captain anymore. See, he wasn't really allowed to leave the harbor. His men, a few of them were allowed to stay in Marseille, but most of them were dispersed elsewhere throughout France. That would make it a lot harder for Simon Danziker to gather his men in the tavern, buy a few rounds of drinks, and convince them all to relive their glory days by going out on a cruise to attack a few Spanish or Italian vessels. And then, of course, the nearly 1,000 escaped slaves he brought with him were sent back to their homes. This earned him a lot of goodwill, as you might imagine, but the king was no fool, nor was his father-in-law, and they both saw that Danziker kept to his regulations. But the money and the ships and the fame and the royal writ did carry a lot of weight. I can almost imagine the governor standing there alongside his daughter with a false smile plastered across his face. I can imagine the warm welcome he offered to Simon Danziker, but all the while I can imagine the maybe chagrin he felt inside. However, after a few days to get settled, Ali Rais, the devil captain, among the most famous pirates in the world, bought a reasonable house in town, moved his wife and son in, and began to settle down. The King of France had other plans for Danziker, but for now put a pin in that. Since the escape from Algiers, I haven't mentioned Sir Francis Verney. Danziker left him behind in Algiers when he pulled off his great escape. And Sir Francis was English. He was white, he was European, and he was a pirate. None of these things were particularly in favor in Algiers at the moment, but he was Muslim, and faithfully so. Reportedly, he wore his slippers and his turban and his scimitar everywhere he went, all three of which were given to him ceremonially when he converted. Verney was never as powerful or influential as Ward or Danziker. I love his story. It's a fascinating piece of personal drama and distinct from the rest of the pirates, but he wasn't exactly a great pirate. He had his own ship, he had education and a gentlemanly manner, and that got him far in the pirate world. He also had a fair amount of money, but he was never a successful or talented sea commander. The bigger problem for him at the moment, though, was his lack of any rapport with Redouan Pasha. He knew the old day in Tunis, but virtually no one in Algiers, now that all the pirates were gone. And now the fleet of Algiers was burned. Most of the crews for them were massacred, and the slaves meant to man the oars of the galleys were all gone. And all of that was due to a single man, of which Sir Francis Verney was a known associate. I can only imagine this was an uncomfortable moment for Sir Francis, to find himself alone in a city that currently hated pirates, especially the person with whom he had arrived in Algiers. Now, we don't have any accurate account of how things went for him around this time, but we can make some assumptions due to his actions that followed. I feel pretty safe in assuming that the Pasha was furious and full of wrath and wanted to take it out on Sir Francis. Now, he might not have been, but he does seem to have had quite a temper and no love for Europeans, or, in particular, the English. You might remember how he acted toward John Ward, despite having felt no ill effects from the pirate due to the actions of another Englishman. But even if that were the case, somehow Sir Francis talked himself out of any trouble he might have found himself in. Now, that might have something to do with the sudden loss of capable sea commanders that Algiers had just suffered, along with the loss in ships. Sir Francis had a few of his own ships, with their own crews, and all of them with capable commanders. He, and more importantly his men, had the know-how and experience to go out there and to capture more ships. They could bring them back and rebuild the fleet. They could also bring in income that wouldn't be coming in because so many of the Corsair leaders had just been killed. Whatever the reason, the Pasha gave Sir Francis license to do just that, and Francis did well. He rebuilt the strength of the Algerian fleet in just a few months. They weren't the best or the biggest ships in the Mediterranean, but they were good enough to defend the city while the shipwrights were busy rebuilding. It seems kind of like Sir Francis sort of took over Danziker's position after he left. It's kind of natural. There weren't really a lot of European pirates left in Barbary, and the few that were would have gravitated towards the most famous commander among them, Sir Francis. Now, there were still a ton of pirates in North Africa, but they were almost all over in Morocco right now. So Sir Francis did well in Algiers, although not as well as Ward or Danziker by any means. He had the opportunity, maybe, to be as successful and famous as those other two pirates, but he didn't have the experience. He wasn't really much of a sea commander. Remember, he'd never been a privateer. He had occasionally, before becoming a pirate, been a mercenary soldier, but most of his life had been spent as the idle rich there in England. However, he did have a fair amount of talent underneath him, but even with that, even if he had been as talented a commander as Danziker or Ward, it's unlikely he would have reached the same heights. The climate in Barbary had changed toward European pirates. Had Verney himself not been a devout Muslim, he very likely would have been killed, or at the very least chased off. But despite his successes, misfortune did come for Sir Francis Verney. almost a year after Simon Danziker left Barbary for Marseille, Sir Francis was ambushed by a Spanish Coast Guard fleet out in the Mediterranean. They sank one of his ships and damaged the two others. Now, Sir Francis managed to escape the ambush, but he did get caught in a storm immediately after. His men and his ships were all weak after the battle, and he lost another one of his fleet. Sir Francis still managed to escape the inevitable. He limped back to Algiers, but his crew was sick and injured, and his ship was battered. And then he found himself in a familiar position. In much the same way that his mentor, Jack Ward, had experienced a few months earlier, Sir Francis Verney found that the populace of his home city turned on him right when he was at his weakest. They thought that he needed to answer for the loss of life. Now, there are letters in the archives of the Verney household saved from their most famous and least loved son. Remember, his stepmother and his estranged wife/stepsister were still running the household. Those letters from Sir Francis begged them to let him return to England, to petition the king for a pardon. It's, in a lot of ways, surprising that these letters still exist, considering they went unanswered by his family. It appears that as far as they were concerned, Sir Francis was dead. He had been as soon as he converted to Islam. Perhaps they held a spark of hope he would return before then, but at that point, there was no turning back. I do wonder who chose to save those letters. I feel like had his mother-in-law received them, she would have burned them or thrown them out. Maybe his estranged wife still held a little bit of affection for her one-time husband. But here, history loses track of Sir Francis Verney after those letters were sent. For some time, he's gone from the pages of history until, 5 years later, William Lithgow, the Scottish traveler that gave us our last account of John Ward as an old man in Tunis, well, after he met with John Ward on his return trip to Europe, he stopped off in Sicily. It's a natural stopping point on that voyage, but it is a little bit coincidental that he visited a hospital there, St. Mary of Pity, and there he found a familiar face. It was Sir Francis Verney. He was sick, and he was dying. William Lithgow met with him and recorded Verney's account of his final years. After his family ignored his pleas to come home, Verney was forced to go back out to sea with what proved to be a fraction of the power he'd once held. It was on that voyage, unable to defend himself, that he was captured by a Sicilian ship and forced to work the oars as a galley slave. Now, on this voyage, he was the only European on the ship. Everyone else was a Barbary native. Luckily for him, a Jesuit priest found his way on board this Sicilian galley and found a conspicuous European among a crew of North African galley slaves. The priest asked this European who he was to be put in such a position, and Sir Francis told him his name and then his story. He told everything from his tumultuous life in England to his self-imposed exile, from his time serving as a soldier in the Netherlands and then in Morocco, to his eventual turn to piracy. He told the priest of his decision to convert to Islam, and then finally, he told the priest about the windfall of sorrow that had brought him here. The priest convinced Sir Francis to come back into the Christian fold. Now, Sir Francis had been a member of the English church before this, but the Jesuits saw him baptized as a Catholic, and then found him employment in the Sicilian army. This wasn't glorious work. It wasn't the sort of work that would normally be expected of a young English nobleman, nor was it anything to compare with the heights of being a famous pirate, but it was honest work. Now, Sir Francis did this for some time, but all the while in his chest he kept his turban, his slippers, and his scimitar. Coincidentally, it was during a skirmish with Muslim corsairs at the battlements that Sir Francis was wounded and grew ill. He was taken to the local hospital, St. Mary of Pity, where he waited out his days expecting death. And it was there, in pain and nearing the end of his life, that William Lithgow found him and took his very last confessions and an account of his last days. Sir Francis had asked 2 final favors of Lithgow, who he'd known for some time, if not well. He had virtually no money, so he asked for William Lithgow to pay for a proper burial when he died. Lithgow, a man of his word, did so, there on the grounds of the hospital. And then Verney gave him all the money he had left in the world and asked one final favor, for Lithgow to return the chest back to England to his one-time wife. Lithgow had a few more adventures in his travels, or at least wrote that he did, but he did eventually get the chest back to the Verney estate. When his estranged wife opened the chest, she found a small pouch filled with gold and jewels, enough to pay for his burial and more, quite a bit more, but it was all hidden underneath a turban, slippers, and a scimitar. Her mother, Francis Verney's mother-in-law, had passed away by this point, and if his estranged wife did hold a little affection in her heart, it showed here. He had been officially declared dead by his stepmother, but his wife, his one-time wife, kept those 3 articles, his turban, his slippers, and his scimitar. And today, you can actually go see them. They are on display under glass in the ancestral home of the Verney family. Next time, we will finish the tale of Simon Danziker. We will also share a quick note about Jack Ward, and then we will move on to the independent pirate republic of Salé. When we left off last time, Simon Danziker was relaxing in Marseille with his wife and son alongside his pardon from King Henry IV of France. Sir Francis Verney was in Algiers, serving as a sort of replacement to Danziker. We followed his story as it turned to sorrow and his eventual death in 1615. Most of the rest of the pirates, including John Ward, Bill Graves, Richard Bishop, John Easton, and William Saxbridge, well, they were all headed west through the Strait of Gibraltar toward the main Atlantic port of North Africa, in Morocco. We're going to let Danziker spend some quality time with his family for a while he still could. For now, we're going to focus on that group headed for Morocco. More specifically, we're going to focus on 2 pirates who have yet to be introduced. They've been around this whole time, operating in Simon Danziker's fleet. Their names were Yvon de Veenboer and Jan Jansoen. Their biographies could begin almost verbatim in the same fashion as John Ward or Simon Danziker or, Peter Easton or almost anybody in this story. They were Dutch sailors who served as privateers in the Dutch Revolt, and then when hostilities ended due to the ceasefire, they traveled to Barbary where they could continue work as privateers, even though they were now labeled as pirates. That's why I love Sir Francis Verney's story. It's so different from everything else we have. One of these new characters, Jan Jansoen, wasn't a captain when he came to Barbary. Ward and Verney and Danziker and Veenboer were all captains of privateer vessels, but not Jansoen. He was a crew member, a pilot and steerer on board Veenboer's ship. It was as a pirate, as a Barbary Corsair, that he rose through the ranks to finally become a captain and own his own ship. But again, none of that is particularly interesting or unique. There were dozens of other pirates who had stories just like that. But then we don't remember most of their names, and we do remember the name of Jan Jansoen, because his story is a lot more interesting, and it's interesting to me mostly because of how pertinent it is to our overall story of pirates and piracy. This is episode 98, Immortal Super Pirate. And we actually remember Jan Jansoen by a few other names as well. In a lot of older English documents, they will anglicize his name to John Johnson, but that's pretty par for the course. But Jansoen took a new name during his time in Barbary, Murat Rais. As did so many of his fellows, he converted to Islam at some point during his tenure in Algiers, but it appears that he actually continued to use his birth name more than Murat Rais, but everyone who converted to Islam took a new name. And he chose Murat, which was an exceedingly popular name. It's derived from the Arabic name Murad in Turkish. Now, we already know that Rais is the Turkish equivalent of the rank of sea captain, or maybe beyond that to admiral. And Murad, or Murat, is so common, there have been 5 different Ottoman sultans named Murad. But more than that, we've already talked about one particularly high-profile sea commander named Murat Reis as well. Now he's often called Murat Reis the Elder, to distinguish him from Jansun, or Murat Reis the Younger. Murat Reis the Elder was one of Hayreddin Barbarossa's primary successors, and he, the Elder he had a very long career. He was a captain at the Battle of Privesa all the way back in 1535. He operated throughout those years, and then finally, on the sidelines of the conquest of Cyprus in 1570 and the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. That's 33 years at sea right there. And if he was already a captain at Privesa, we can assume that he was at least, 25 maybe? That means that at Lepanto in 1571 he would have been nearing 60. And we're still a few decades away from Murat Reis the Younger. Nonetheless, there are still tons of older historians that just kind of cram Murat Reis the Elder and Younger into one pirate. They take the deeds of at least 2 different corsairs and combine them into one, he would have had to have been very old pirate. And I say that there were at least 2 because some modern historians think that there were probably more than 2 Barbary pirates named Murat Reis. As in, the pirate at Privesa, in the earlier half of the 1500s, was a different captain with a coincidental name from the corsair who would follow in Barbarossa's footsteps, and both of them were separate from Jan Jansun. And some even think that there was another pirate named Murat Reis who was active in the Mediterranean in the 1630s. So they're generally separated into Murat Reis the Elder and the Younger, but it might be in fact as many as 4 pirates. And that honestly makes a lot of sense. Just look at the Wikipedia page for Murat Reis the Elder. It starts off in Privesa, and then there's a bunch of other stuff for the next 70 years or so, and then it concludes with his death after a battle with the Knights of Malta in 1638. And that just doesn't add up at all. Privesa happened in 1538, so that's 100 years later. But you see a lot of these older historians writing in the 18th and 19th centuries mostly, and one work I've got from 1932 that expects you to accept that there was this, 130-year-old Muslim corsair terrorizing the waves. But, he only popped up every couple of decades, but it was all the same person. I assume that they believed this was some sort of immortal super pirate who would go to sea, kill and ravage for a few years, and then slink back to his lair where he fed on the fears of innocent children until he was strong enough to emerge once again. And he would always take the form of your greatest fear, even though usually that just means he was dressed up like a clown, but like a really spooky clown. But in reality, there was probably more of sort of a Dread Pirate Roberts thing happening here. One pirate realizing that it was the name that inspired the necessary fear. But all that aside, we're going to refer to Murat Reis the Younger as Jan Jansun to avoid any confusion here. He was verifiably taking part in the battle at Algiers, the battle in the harbor that broke the Spanish blockade. He was on board the ship of Ivan de Vinboer as a pilot, and Vinboer was kind of a commodore under Szymon Danziker. If Dali Reis was the admiral of the Algerian fleet, then Vinboer would have been a sub-commander under him with his own unit of maybe a dozen or more ships. But after the blockade was broken and the pirates all left Algiers, that Algerian pirate fleet sort of fragmented. The basis for their naval structure, the government of Algiers, was not a part of their lives anymore, so they separated into their smaller units under each of a few top commanders. The devil captain, Szymon Danziker, was the biggest and most prominent of these, but there was also, most notably, Groot Piet and Ivan de Vinboer. They were his number 2 lieutenants, you might say. And then, when Szymon Danziker turned around to arrange his pardon, return to Algiers, betray the Pasha, and escape to France, most of his fleet didn't go with him. They stayed with either Groot Piet or most of them with Ivan de Vinboer. And nearly all of them stayed the course for Morocco. They had the entire fleet of John Ward and his followers, minus Sir Francis Verney, with them, but this was really a Dutch-led coalition. I do wonder if Simon Danziker told the ship captains underneath him what he was planning, or that he did intend to go back to Algiers and attack them violently. I think probably he slipped away. That's not the sort of thing you want to tell your now majority Muslim crew members. But there's also a possibility, as we'll explore in a bit, that the Dutch had received another set of options, a set of options that would change the course of their lives and that Danziker wanted no part of. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But this fragmentation of the fleet is the kind of thing that we are going to see a lot in the world of pirates. I mean, Drake was always the commander and Morgan was always the commander, but they were really privateers, not exactly pirates. But if you take the pirate republic at Nassau, for example, well, you've got Benjamin Hornigold, a fleet commander in the role of someone like Danziker, who had pirates like Blackbeard and Sam Bellamy operating beneath him. But once it grew expedient for those other pirates to branch off into their own smaller fleets, they did so. You see the same thing under Peter Jennings with Charles Vane and Calico Jack. It happened all the time. But right now, we're getting the first glimmers of that element of pirate life, right here, headed out of Algiers, the anarchic, almost libertarian aspect of the pirate hierarchy. The chain of command was important to anybody operating at sea, but for pirates it was only important to a point. You could hitch your wagon to another, stronger, more famous pirate, and if you didn't have the guns or the men or the fame to be a successful pirate, that makes sense. But if you didn't need to, then why would you share the plunder? So all of these pirates, the English and mostly Dutch, made for Morocco. They traversed the strait while avoiding notice all the way to the Atlantic seaport of Salé. Salé, we've mentioned it briefly before, but, well, first of all, Salé is an anglicized pronunciation of an ancient name. It's one of those settlements that's been occupied by dozens of different empires all throughout the ancient world at one point or another. The name probably comes from the Phoenicians, or really the Carthaginians, that called it Shalat, but even they didn't found the city. It had been occupied since prehistory. But of course the Romans conquered Africa and took over the settlement, and they called it Sala. And Sala remained an insignificant seaport on the edge of the world for several centuries. The Visigothic invaders, for example, never paid much mind to the city. There is a little bit of archaeological evidence of trade with the Visigoths and later with the Byzantines, but there was no expansionistic building during the Roman or post-Roman period. At least, not until an Islamic caliphate arose and arrived at the edge of North Africa. Once they expanded all the way to the Atlantic and up into Spain, they occupied Sala. But even for them, an Atlantic seaport still wasn't really a priority. Until about the 11th century, when that caliphate who occupied it fell, and different factions in the region all went to war for control. Then, all of a sudden, a seaport that could reach Spain and was outside of the Channel suddenly seemed like a very, very good thing to have. So the people who were in control of Sala seriously improved the defenses. The inland capital of Morocco, at this time and for some time to come, was the city of Fez. From Fez, the Bouregreg River meets the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Sultan, the Moroccan king at the time, built what was essentially an entire new port and fortress on the northern bank of the river. Now, the city on the southern bank they called Chala, but he named the city on the northern bank Sala, much like the Romans had. In practice, this new city was really just a massive fortress with an exquisitely well-protected dock that guarded the approach to the capital. Anybody who wanted to come downriver to the Atlantic or travel upriver to Fez would have to pass by this exquisitely protected fortress. But as far as everyday civic use was concerned, it really didn't serve a whole lot of purpose. Most of the people still lived on the southern bank of the river. They had their homes and their farms and their trading routes already built there, so there's not a lot of incentive for them to cross the river and start a new life. And because all of the people still lived on the southern bank, nearly all the maritime traffic coming through the mouth of the Bouregreg River went through the city on the southern bank. So the Sultan had to build another fortress, and this one he named after the Arabic word for fortress, Rabat. Today, Rabat is the modern capital of Morocco, but the northern fortification, Salé, just kind of sat empty. I mean, the ruler would certainly order the fortification manned and occupied in a time of war, but that didn't serve much purpose when they did not yet know they were at war. So whenever somebody decided to attack these two cities, that northern fortress was always the first target. Time and again, enemies would sail in and occupy Salé on the north bank. They would man the guns and guard that harbor and immediately grab a deeply important strategic position that controlled all of the river traffic to and from the capital. It happened in that first war, after the second fortification at Rabat was built. When another major Islamic caliphate rose to power, they used Salé as an inroad to the capital of Morocco. The Castilians would do the same thing a couple of centuries later, and then, during the Reconquista, the Muslim princes of Cordoba, who were pushed out of Spain down to Morocco, used that same tactic. And that's a lot of history right there, so in hindsight, you'd think the pattern would become pretty obvious. You'd think someone along the line would realize that maybe they should man the guns up there on the north bank. But no one did. It was expensive and seemed most of the time unnecessary to do so. So whenever it really mattered, the fortress was usually just empty. And it should have mattered right now. Right as these pirates were on their way to occupy this fortress, Morocco was currently embroiled in a civil war. The king of Morocco, the probably rightful king of Morocco, was a man named Zidane, and he had been pushed south by two different rebel factions. One of them, the more important of the two, at least to our story, was a Sufi mystic named Ahmed ibn Abi Mahali, and he was deeply anti-Spanish and had a lot of popular support because of it. King Zidane would occasionally take a conciliatory tone towards Spain. He used the war between Spain and England and the Netherlands to take back a lot of his territory, but when Spain noticed what he had done, he tried to soothe the wounds. Ahmed ibn Abi Mahali certainly had no need to soothe any wounds. His rhetoric was deeply anti-Spanish, and the people loved him for it. And currently, this Sufi mystic controlled Fez, Rabat, and Salé. As far as Morocco was concerned, and even today still is, that's the most important and kind of central corridor to the country. Ignoring the coastal settlements, that's where the people lived. But of course, as usual, because he felt secure, the fortress at Salé sat empty. Now, do you remember a man named Samuel Palash? We talked about him a long time ago. He was a Sephardi Jew with familial ties to Spain. His family was from Spain, but they had been kicked out when Spain kicked all the Jews out. But he was born and raised in Fez, the capital of Morocco, and he grew up as a smuggler and pirate. But he moved on to be a diplomat and spy. I really like Samuel Palash. He was awesome. When I think about him, I think about a Jewish pirate Zorro. And when we talked about him, it was so long ago because I intended to get to this bit of story a lot sooner. But all this time that we've been talking about other topics, about Ward and Danziker and the events in the Mediterranean and the Rainieri Sodorina and the Charity and the Pearl and all that time, Samuel Palash has been busy in the Netherlands. When Palash was operating as a spy in Madrid, his primary conspirator was a Spanish viceroy in Morocco. But eventually he saw the light and went to the Inquisition and confessed everything. The Inquisition came after Palash, and he escaped with them at his heels, but he made his way to the Netherlands. And he'd been working there ever since to craft an alliance between the King of Morocco, Zidane, and the Prince of Orange in the Netherlands. Now that's really only been a couple of years, but the Prince of Orange, he was the son and heir of William the Silent, who was the founder of the House of Orange-Nassau. They are perhaps one of the 4 or 5 most important dynasties in our story, right up there with the Habsburgs and the Bourbons and the Stuarts. The Netherlands didn't have a king, but if they did, it would have been whoever came from the House of Orange-Nassau. In this case, the son of William the Silent, Philip William of Orange. Both he and the king, Zidane of Morocco, well, they were open to an alliance. They saw a lot to be gained there, but there were a number of serious roadblocks in the way to that alliance, most notably Spain. You know, the 80 Years' War was on hold, but it wasn't exactly over. Spain had sort of de facto allowed the Netherlands her independence, but it was sort of understood that they were saying, all right, you can have your cute little council for now, but you should know that once we train up a new generation of young men to fight, we're going to take the country back. And everyone in the Netherlands knew this was coming. They knew when war came again, they would need all the friends they could get. They had sort of an alliance with France, which was great, and England was basically the same, and as it happens, all three would fight together in the war to come. But as an ally, with Morocco so close to Spain, on the other side of Spain, they would prove to be invaluable. If you could bring them into your fold, that would be a real coup. It would force Spain to divide her attention. She couldn't just look to the north and to the east, she'd have to keep fleets down south as well. And it was a pretty sweet deal for the King of Morocco as well. The Netherlands, and England as it happened, both offered to help the king win his current civil war to take his throne back. And they also said that once that was won, and his country was no longer embroiled in civil war, they would help force Spain out of Morocco. So that all sounds pretty great for everybody involved, which is why everybody was interested. But for King Zidane, it was a dangerous proposition. See, if he were to allow this alliance to happen, he would be in great danger. The benefits were huge, but he might not live to see those benefits. He had enemies from within already, and should this alliance become known to the King of Spain, they would certainly send fleets and armies to destroy Morocco, and in that situation, the Netherlands looked really far away. So if this was to happen, the King of Spain couldn't know. So, mediating between King Zidane and the Prince of Nassau, Palash had to address these two problems. First of all, the enemies within. Imagine if, hypothetically, the Netherlands could somehow secure many more men for the current war, many more ships for the current war, many more guns for the current war, and aid the king in winning a great victory against his rivals, enough to rally the people to him for a change. But then the second problem, Spain. If the Netherlands did that, it would have to be kept quiet. Spain couldn't know what was happening here. Now, I'd like to say ahead of time, this is my theory based solely on circumstantial evidence, and more than that, really just me really wanting it to be true because it would be so cool, but what if Samuel Palash orchestrated just that? Men, ships, guns, and a singularly important victory, all while keeping it quiet from Spain. What if he used his contacts within the underground there in Europe, and he certainly had many from his years as a smuggler and a spy? What if he used them to contact agents in the employ of the Barbary pirates? We know that Ward and Danziker had quite a way of learning what was happening in Europe before anyone else should have. We know they had agents there. What if Samuel Palash knew how to contact them, or knew men who knew how at least? What if those agents got word to the pirates that they were needed in Morocco? Not only were they needed, the benefits were huge. First of all, it would be an easy victory. Taking the fortress of Salé was a joke. It was empty. And then there were guns and powder and plenty of stores for them to use. They could occupy the fortress in a day, before anyone knew what was happening, and then defend it from the pathetic excuse of a navy that Rabat had to offer. You know, that alone is significantly better than the deal any of them had in Algiers or in Tunis or anywhere else in Barbary. Rather than splitting the cost of operations with some leader in their city, they could keep it all for themselves. Plus, it would be an easily defended port, exactly what they needed. They could hold out against anything but an entire Spanish armada combined with a Spanish army, and the Spanish were unlikely to commit those resources to oust them from a port that nobody cared about. It offered them access to the lucrative Moroccan shipping that was coming down from the capital. That's good. It certainly would have been better than what was coming out of Venice, for example, at the time, but more than that, It offered them access to the lucrative Spanish and Portuguese treasure galleons returning home. Even if Samuel Palache and the Dutch Republic had nothing at all to do with the pirates' decision to do just what they did, those were still very good reasons to do it. Barbary was growing uncomfortable, and the Mediterranean was far less lucrative than it had been. Trade still existed there, but it was nowhere near as rich as that which was sailing into Spain and Portugal every day. Oh, look, Venice is sending another galley of wheat to France, yay. And the slaves in the Mediterranean were lucrative, but the cargo wasn't. Compare that to the cargo returning from Asia or the Americas. Indigo, sugar, spices, jewels, precious stones, silver, and gold. Those were hard to come by in the Mediterranean. That alone was reason enough to move to an Atlantic port. But I really enjoy playing with the idea that there may have been deeper political motivations here. What they did hinder shipping for the Sufi rebels. It did aid the Sultan of Morocco against his enemies quite a bit. But there's no evidence to suggest that any of that is true, to suggest that Samuel Palache did contact the Barbary pirates. And honestly, why would there be? It would have been a clandestine message sent between human beings, not a written letter. But that's the sort of drama I love. But while we don't have much in the way of official documentation here, there are a few pieces of the puzzle that suggest there might be something to what I'm saying. Sultan Zaidan had armies, but virtually no fleet. The Sufi rebel, Ahmed, who was in control of Rabat, Fez, and Salé, he had a fleet at one time, but Spain destroyed it in a devastating series of attacks. The lack of a fleet there in Rabat would have made taking the fortress easy. The pirates could have sailed in boldly and taken Salé, and that was in their own interest. But it was also in the interest of Sultan Zaidan, and thus it would have been in the interest of Samuel Palache, who was trying to create an alliance there. So, cui bono, who benefits here? But then look at the parties that it would have hindered very, very much. Ahmed, the Sufi rebel, who controlled Fez and Rabat, would have been hurt by this move significantly. And then, with the pirates operating out of Salé to attack Spanish and Portuguese shipping, the King of Spain. But there aren't really any records of how the capture of Salé occurred. Were there perhaps some people there defending the battlements? We don't know. Was there a bombardment? Maybe, but probably not. It's more likely that Salé was, as usually, virtually abandoned, maybe a skeleton force. But the pirates probably just sailed in and took over in a quiet, bloodless, quick attack. All this lack of evidence proves to be a major problem in trying to tell this story. I would love to fill in the gaps with dramatic tales of pirates meeting on board, planning their moves, and then inside the fortress celebrating. I could tell you that it was a dark night, a thunderstorm was beating upon the roof, and candlelight flickered over their nefarious visages. And if we were making a movie of this event, I would definitely do that. But as we know, most pirates, and these pirates especially, really didn't keep records. That leaves us at the mercy of independent chroniclers and government records. And there weren't very many independent chroniclers available here. The agents that were usually operating in Barbary, working for Venice or France or England or the Netherlands or Spain or whoever, well, they weren't in Morocco. They were still in Barbary, seeing what was going on in the important region of North Africa. And Morocco, it was an anarchy. There were at least 3 major factions fighting for the throne, and virtually everyone was a warlord with an army at his back who had hitched his wagon to one or another of those factions. Trade and commerce had come to a standstill due to the war, and it allowed the pirates to take a fortress with virtually nobody noticing. That's the kind of environment that's perfect for a group of lawless men who want to set up shop out of which they can attack Spain and Portugal, but it's not great when you're trying to tell their story with as much historical accuracy as possible. What we do know from government records around the time, and there are a few, is that around this time a large number of Dutch and English corsairs under Ivan de Veenboer, they arrived in Salé to set up shop. We know this from 2 sources. First come from the government records of the Kingdom of Spain. About this time, Spain was preparing for yet another ethnic cleansing. They were planning to round up and kick out a bunch of Moriscos, We've called them previously conversos on this show. The Moriscos, or conversos, were descendants of former Muslims who had converted to Catholicism. Now, these Moriscos were themselves Catholic, at least on the surface, but the Inquisition and the Spanish government never saw them as anything else but Muslims in hiding. And there was a big plan in the works to take their land and their property and all of their possessions and kick them out to the winds. But before Spain was able to do that, a large number of them from the more remote parts of western Spain packed up all of their goods and left. That meant that they got to keep all of their money and all of their possessions instead of letting Spain steal it. And then they chartered ships, or at least took ships, out of the harbors of Spain to sail south and landed in Salé, right in the clutches of the pirates. For a bunch of rural Spanish Moriscos, mostly farmers and ranchers, we might expect the pirates in Salé to be a terrifying shock. You might picture the pirates licking their bloody knives and preparing to do terrible things to these poor conversos, but it appears that they were greeted amicably by the pirates. And it even looks like the Moriscos may have chosen to go there. It's even possible that some of them had already made their way to Salé before any of the pirates arrived. So imagine this. Imagine a certain Sephardi Jewish former spy who had operated in Spain who wanted to further damage Spain and help out the embattled king of his home country, all the while trying to build a relationship between his king and the Netherlands. Imagine what he might do if he found out about this plan from the king of Spain to kick out all of these Moriscos. Maybe he was able to get word to those Moriscos. He certainly had the contacts in Spain to do so, and he would have perhaps chartered them passage to a fortress where he had very recently encouraged a bunch of Dutch pirates to sail. He knew that these pirates were there, and he told these Moriscos, in this imaginary hypothetical, that there would be a group of European Muslims who would welcome them in with open arms, with the strength and the power and the guns and the men in the ships to protect them from Spain, to allow them to start a new life where they would no longer be persecuted. It makes some sense. The Moriscos, who would likely have gone to Morocco, didn't speak any Turkish or Arabic or native Berber. They spoke Spanish. They didn't know that much about Moroccan culture. Even if they were Muslims, secretly, Morocco was a foreign country. They knew about rural Spanish culture, so they would have probably been more comfortable with the European Muslim Corsairs in Salé. And that's where they settled. Thousands of them settled in Salé over the course of a few months shortly after the pirates arrived. And those Moriscos began to build a civic structure in Salé. They elected councils and established markets and built homes. Over the next few years, they began settling down and having children and occasionally marrying pirates. And this is the long game we're talking about, more than a decade of development, but the interesting thing about the way that these Morisco exiles and the pirates interacted, well, it's mostly through their economy and their flags. The agricultural life in Morocco was difficult. The civil war was not even close to ending, so moving out to the countryside to start a farm was not a good option. Bandits and roving bands of rebel factions were likely to kill you and take your food. Staying inside a fortress guarded by hundreds of pirates seemed like a much better idea. So they would have been able to grow enough food to sustain themselves, but no cash crops for sale. There were no figs or hashish, there was no wine they were making or olive oil. But soon the docks of Salé became home to one of the busiest and most profitable marketplaces along the Atlantic coast. So what was it they were trading? These Morisco exiles. Well, the pirates were still the backbone of Salé, most notably Ivan de Veenboer and his lieutenant, who had now raised himself up to the level of captain, Jan Jansoen. In a lot of ways, Ivan de Veenboer was sort of the unofficial leader of Salé. Naturally, these religious exiles were trading in goods brought in by the pirates. They were fences who were selling these goods to whomever was unscrupulous enough to buy them. and those were usually less than legal merchants from England and the Netherlands, as well as Barbary and, to a lesser extent, France. So why were they sailing to Salé to buy goods? Well, the things that were available there were extraordinarily valuable and hard to come by. Sugar, spices, indigo, silver, fruit, whatever the bounty of the Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires was, that was traded in Salé, and you might be able to buy some of that in Spain, but they were unwilling, usually, to trade with these Protestant merchants, and if they would, the prices would be extraordinarily high. They were much more reasonable when they were stolen goods. So we can look at this as the time that England and the Netherlands, who were just a few years away from making their first inroads into the Spanish and Portuguese empires in the East Indies and the West Indies, this was when they were really getting their first taste of the fruits of empire. France was in much the same position. As for Barbary, on the other hand, they were buying goods that they were going to take back home to the Ottoman Empire to trade. Now those nations, England, the Dutch Republic, the Ottoman Empire, and France, they were all going to be allies very soon in a cataclysmic war against Catholic Europe. They would all be on the same side in the 30 Years' War, more or less. Now, this might just be coincidence. They may have been friendly nations with a similar outlook on Catholic Habsburg Europe, but it's telling here that none of them ever attacked Salé. If this were a city full of rotten pirates, then why not attack it? Well, it would be... what's the old saying? The enemy of my enemy is my friend? And these pirates were focusing on the Spanish and Portuguese, their enemies. And England would go on to attack some other pirate havens in just a few years. They would attack Algiers with a serious force and destroy the corsairs that were left there, but not Salé. The Dutch, they were too busy expanding out into the world, but they had ample opportunity to take Salé, and they never did so, nor did the French or the Ottomans. And then, well, before that, let's look at the flags. Most of the corsairs sailing out of Salé flew the flag of Salé. It was a green banner with a two-bladed scimitar. That's an ancient Islamic symbol that's actually evocative of Barbarossa's own banner. But the pirates in particular started sailing with a naval banner underneath, a red triangle, and that became known as the Salé Rouge, or the Red Banner of Salé. And that flag, which occasionally had a crescent moon on it to represent Islam, became iconic. The Salé Rouge was the color of the Salé Rovers. It became the pirate flag. It was recognized as the most piratical symbol in the world. And we usually picture black as the traditional color of the Jolly Roger, but red was almost as common, all throughout the eras of piracy. If the Jolly Roger was intended to instill fear, red was the color of blood after all. Henry Avery famously flew a red standard, and that's what we based our logo on here on the Pirate History Podcast. One of the very few surviving actual skull and crossbones flags that was used in piracy is a red flag. And that's a tradition that we can trace back to these pirates, to these Salé Rovers and the Salé Rouge. But two of them had another tradition. Veenboer and Jan Janssen both flew the Salé Rouge when out at sea. But whenever they were moving in to attack a Spanish vessel, they took down the Salé Rouge and raised the Dutch flag, which is a bold and not at all subtle message. You know, the triangle in red, the Salé Rouge, that was a symbol that said, I am a pirate and I am here to destroy you and steal your goods. But when they raised that Dutch flag, it was telling the Spanish something else. It was telling them that for these men, the war that these one-time privateers had been fighting against Spain, well, it was far from over. Now you might ask, if they weren't attacking the Spanish, did they fly the Salé Rouge? Would they fly the red standard when attacking English or French or even Dutch ships? The answer is no, they didn't, because they didn't fly any flag when attacking those ships because they didn't attack those ships. And keep in mind that these pirates had had no compunction in attacking French or English vessels in the Mediterranean. when they had been operating for the pashas and deys of Tunis and Algiers, they would attack whoever they could find. Some of them had problems attacking their home country, but other than that it was open season. But here they stuck mostly to Catholic ships from Spain and Portugal. Now, they were close by, Spanish and Portuguese ships, so they were readily available, but they were really near the strait, and the Strait of Gibraltar would have had traffic from every nation that would have offered prey from anyone they chose to steal from. And at first they did capture a few English or Dutch or French ships, but delegates from those countries, after only a few attacks, were sent down to Salé, and they worked out sort of a deal. The indigo and the sugar and the spices that they captured, all of that was extremely profitable, but all of that paled in comparison to the real product that was on offer at the market in Salé, and that was slaves. They were selling sub-Saharan African slaves, the sort that most of us usually think of when we think about slavery, and those were being sold mostly to Europeans, but there were tons of European slaves being sold to the Ottoman Empire, and that's as it always had been for these Barbary Corsairs. But those delegates from France and England and the Netherlands, well, they negotiated an agreement with the Salé rovers that prevented them from capturing any of their own subjects for slavery. It prevented them from capturing any of their ships for sale or their goods for sale. It limited what the Salé rovers would attack to the Catholic powers of Europe, which meant almost entirely Spanish and Portuguese. And the Salé rovers, or really more accurately, the Moriscos who officially met with this delegation, received benefits from these deals. If they could convince the pirates not to attack ships from these nations, which they were willing to do, they would receive financial and military consideration. So those Moriscos grew rich. The Salé rovers grew rich. Everyone in Salé prospered, at the expense, primarily, of the Spanish Empire. So, does any of this story sound familiar to you? You've got a bunch of pirates operating out of a fortified city that they captured from Spain. The city was populated by religious exiles from Spain. The governments of England and the Netherlands and eventually France backed the local government, and those religious exiles acted as fences to sell the pirated goods from Spain all around the world. It sounds quite a bit like Port Royal or Tortuga, all of the great pirate havens of the Caribbean that would come to follow in the next 50 or 60 years. You've got the Huguenots in Tortuga, you've got the Jews and the Protestants in Jamaica, and they operated on much the same principle. Pirates were there to steal from the Spanish and protect those fortress cities, while the religious exiles were there to buy and sell their goods and make everybody very, very rich. But none of those pirate havens are the most famous pirate haven. That distinction goes to none other than Nassau in the Bahamas. And there's a different distinction that connects Nassau and Salé much more powerfully than any of the others. A few years after the pirates and the Moriscos arrived in Salé, the city found itself under a bunch of pressure from Spain. The 30 Years' War was close to breaking out, and Salé was a thorn in Spain's side that was inflaming that conflict. The other nations that were to be involved, France, England, the Netherlands, they were all hesitant to aid Salé in fear of a premature outbreak of war. So the residents of Salé needed to defend themselves. The former leader of Salé, the unofficial leader, Ivan de Venboer, well, he'd been retired for a few years now. Coincidentally, he was living alongside Jack Ward in Tunis until Jack Ward died, but he was busy enjoying his wealth. Jan Janssen had taken over his position as the most famous and recognizable pirate in Salé, but he took that a step further. He had himself named the High Admiral of Salé, and made all of the other pirates swear an oath to follow him should war come. But then he took a step further than that. He campaigned for and was elected as the president of the independent Corsair Republic of Salé. In this, they made it official. They were not a part of the Kingdom of Morocco. They were not a part of the Netherlands or England or France or Spain or anyone else. They were an independent pirate republic, which is a story that can't be told about Tortuga or Port Royal. It can really only be told about 3 places in the entire world. The first happened here at Salé, and the last, barring a few other lesser versions of the story, happened at Nassau, in the Pirate Republic of the Bahamas. Now, Yan Yan soon took charge of the city and her military dictatorship, and he ruled for about 3 years and saw the town and the fortress through some pretty serious times with the Spanish. The whole story there is an exciting, swashbuckling tale, but eventually the independent pirate republic was going to fall. It was largely internal. Yan Yan soon and many of his pirates left the city behind, as much as it was an external attack. But that dream of a pirate republic was a dream that wouldn't disappear for more than a century, a dream of a nation for the pirates and governed by the pirates. But I'm not going to tell that entire story. I wanted to draw these comparisons because they're going to influence how we tell the story moving on, but it's time to move on. We're not going to talk about Salé in any real depth. We're not going to talk about the politics involved in any depth at all. Soon we're going to move on to the next stage of that dream for an independent pirate republic, and we're going to talk about the second attempt to found a real nation by the pirates and for the pirates. A nation that, well, it's almost mythological, called the Nation of Libertalia. I've been watching a lot of westerns lately. I suspect I'm not alone in that. With Red Dead Redemption coming out and the Coen brothers releasing The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, I think the mythology of the Old West has been popping up in a lot of people's purview lately. I've always sort of liked westerns, especially as a kid, but not really. I watched a few of them, but most were boring and slow. When I was pretending to be a film snob in my early 20s, I watched The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, along with most of Clint Eastwood's catalog, and I enjoyed them, but I enjoyed them mostly for the gunfights. I don't think I really understood them, not until recently, and I'm only beginning to now. In part, I think my renewed interest in the Western comes from getting older. You know, as a kid, I really liked Young Guns. As a teenager, I liked Tombstone. But neither of those are really Westerns. They take place in the Old West. They have cowboys, they have gunfights, and they have saloons, but they're Westerns in the same way that Star Wars is a sci-fi movie, or that Alien is a sci-fi movie. Star Wars is really a fantasy, just set in space, and Alien is really a horror movie set in space. The Westerns I liked growing up were action movies set in the Old West. They looked like Westerns, they had all the trappings of a Western, but their themes and their pacing were those of action movies, not of Westerns. Now that I could probably be called an adult, now that I'm getting old enough to see the culture shifting from that in which I grew up, I'm really starting to see the allure of the Western. The sociologist Will Wright tells us in his book Six Guns and Society that the Western has themes and structure that define the genre. The structure goes something like this. The main character, who's usually a man and usually a little older, arrives out from the wild into the civilized world. You can picture that scene in almost every Western in history, the scene in which our hero rides into town to have a look around. He's dusty and squinting and clearly out of his element. But then he goes on to enjoy the fruits of the civilized world. Sometimes it will be a kindly homesteader offering him a meal and maybe a bed. Sometimes he'll go to the saloon to partake in whiskey and women. Usually he'll have a bath or a shave, and maybe he'll go shopping. Sometimes he'll end that all with a nice cigar. And from all that evidence, civilization looks great. But then the hero sees the darker side. He'll see brutality and carelessness and all the negative things that the civilized world brings with it. Usually it's a landlord that's to blame. He'll be someone putting up fences and taking people's land. Sometimes the landlord will be actively brutalizing a family with his hired guns. Other times he might be more passive, maybe limiting the people's access to water. So our hero, so recently come in from the wilderness, has to do what he does best: kill people. He shoots all the bad guys, and in the older westerns, the bad guys are usually vaguely Mexican-looking, or maybe Indians, or at least a little bit swarthy. But when all the bad guys are dead, the hero, his job done, rides off into the sunset, back to the wilderness, after having learned that society just doesn't have room for men like him. And the primary conflict in those older, very structured westerns is usually between a strong, clean, virtuous old world and the dirty, weak vices of the new world to come. The best westerns usually take place around the turn of the century, when you've got trains and telegraphs and maybe moving pictures and the whole industrial revolution encroaching on the, independent, hard-scrabble, plucky spirit of the Old West. And that's the theme: a virtuous old world being encroached upon by a villainous new world, by the sins of progress. I mean, think about the stereotypical image of someone watching a western. It's Grandpa, right? He's sitting in his lazy boy, maybe with a beer cracked open, watching John Wayne crack wise and kill Indians. It's about a time when men were men and defended what was theirs. The good old days before bureaucracy started getting in the way, when hard work was what mattered, and these kids today don't know the meaning of a good day's work. They're all about pining for simpler times, now that the world seems to have grown very complicated. And to be fair, I'm not terribly fond of those older westerns, and I hate John Wayne movies. What I like, well, they're called post-westerns. Most of Clint Eastwood's westerns fall into the post-western category, especially his later works. The best of these, I think unanimously, is Unforgiven, but I think that movies like Pale Rider and High Plains Drifter both fall into that category as well. Most of these westerns came out in the 70s, when the traditional western was in decline and the studio system in Hollywood had given way to the auteur. I think it's probable that Cormac McCarthy's books had a lot to do with the rise of the post-western. They might even be given credit for giving birth to the post-western genre. I'm not certain, my timeline might be off there, but most of McCarthy's books are still good examples of the post-western. In much the same way that Star Wars looks like a sci-fi movie, post-westerns look a lot like westerns, typically. Their structure is often very much the same. The protagonist comes in from the wild, runs into conflict with civilization, kills a bunch of people to resolve it, and rides back into the wild. So at face value, these are westerns, but then you find that the themes are different in a number of key ways. The biggest and most obvious difference between the western and the post-western is the antagonist, and who the antagonist usually is. It might still be a land baron, but it's equally likely to be the sheriff. And there were absolutely bad sheriffs in those older traditional westerns, but they were always corrupt. They were subverting the rightful system. In the post-western, the sheriff can still be the bad guy while acting entirely within the law and what might be seen as proper morality. Take, for example, a non-western sheriff here, the Sheriff of Nottingham. I know it's not the same kind of sheriff, but work with me. Nottingham is a bad guy because he and Prince John are working together to undermine the king and to subvert the God-given rightful order of things. That's what makes him a bad guy. That's why it's right for Robin Hood to do what he does. But take the sheriff in Unforgiven. He doesn't break the law. He doesn't take bribes. He isn't out trying to claim more power than he should. And in fact, he actively works at very little else than to enforce the laws of his town. That should be a good guy, but the sheriff in Unforgiven does so in the most unfeeling and brutal fashion imaginable. He orders a couple of cowboys that brutally attacked a prostitute to be whipped in the town square. But then, when their pimp pipes up to complain about lost income, the sheriff instead orders the cowboys to pay him a bunch of horses. He no longer gets a beating, but now they have a hefty fine. And in the eyes of the viewer, that's not right. No justice has been served. But in the eyes of the law, justice has been seen to. Later, that same sheriff catches someone illegally carrying a pistol in town, and he sees that that pistol is taken from him. But he does so through intimidation and a terrible beating. And all the while, this sheriff feels, and in some ways kind of actually is, in the right. He's on the right side of the law, at least, and in many ways, morality. So the major difference so far in Unforgiven is that the antagonist is somebody who never would have served as an antagonist in a more traditional Western. But then there's the protagonist, the man played by Clint Eastwood. His name is literally Money, and he's doing the killing of those two cowboys, not for righteousness, but for money. And when he finally gets down to business by, doing what heroes in cowboy movies do, that is, killing people to solve his problems, you find out that he's not the hero. In fact, I'm fairly certain he's the bad guy in that movie. When he does get down to business, Clint Eastwood is shrouded in darkness. You see him take a drink at the bar, and his eyes are black like a shark's eyes. He's drunk at this point in the movie. He's fallen off the wagon, and he's doing what he's doing not for money, and certainly not for righteousness, but for revenge. And then at the very end of the movie, we see his face framed by the American flag. In most Westerns, this would be a hero shot. This would be the noble end to a job well done, but not here. He's drunk, and he's full of rage and terror and sorrow and despair. He's not the hero right then. He's terrifying. And then when the hero rides back into the wilderness, he doesn't ride into the sunset. He rides into the unadulterated black of a dark and stormy night. This is episode 99, Inevitability. Now, what does all of this have to do with pirates? You are likely thinking right about now. Allow me to explain. When we meet Clint Eastwood's character in Unforgiven, he's reformed. He was a gang member and a thief and a killer, but due to his dearly departed wife and children, he's sticking to the straight and narrow. He's running a hog farm and raising his children. Our hero today, the last pirate of the Barbary pirates with which we will be spending any significant time, similarly came from a violent past. He was a privateer, a mercenary, and then, finally, a pirate. They called him the Devil Captain, Danziker. But he left all of that behind. He went to France to live in lawful peace with his wife and son in Marseille. And much like Clint Eastwood in Unforgiven, he would have preferred to keep it that way. But he wasn't allowed to. When the hero in a post-Western comes into conflict with the villain is almost always an authority figure who is somehow using that authority to harm others around him. Now, that probably has to do with a shifting in American cultural norms. The traditional Western typically comes from the World War II or Cold War era, where Americans were always the good guys and the hero out to save the day. But the post-Westerns typically come from the late 60s and 70s, from a time in which Americans had on the whole lost a lot of faith in their governing structures. The authority figures that they once would have trusted with almost anything were now to be looked upon with suspicion. And thus the villain in these post-Westerns shifted. But even then, even once he comes into conflict with the villain in a post-Western, the hero doesn't act. Because he's never a hero. I mean, look at Eastwood in Unforgiven, or you can look at Tommy Lee Jones in No Country for Old Men, or you can even look at Wolverine in the movie Logan. As Eastwood says in Unforgiven,
just because we're going on this killing, that don't mean I'm going to go back to being the way I was. I just need the money. Get a new start for them youngsters.
Yeah.
I'm just a fella now. I ain't no different than anyone else. No more.
the protagonists in these movies aren't motivated by heroism or righteousness or, the desire to help people. They're motivated by selfish desires or revenge or oftentimes just a lack of any other option. And usually all three, woven together somehow. Eastwood in Unforgiven was killing for money. That's selfish, but it was to provide for his children who were one bad winter away from starvation, a lack of options. And then his partner is killed, and Eastwood just kills everybody. That's revenge. That's not noble. That's not really even admirable. At best, the protagonist in a post-Western is an anti-hero. So what does this have to do with Danziker? Well, he was out of his old life. His violent past was behind him for good now. Or so he thought. What he didn't know is that when his pardon was agreed to, the King of France, Henry IV, already had a plan in mind for Simon Danziker. And in truth, the plan wasn't Henry IV's, it was the brainchild of the highest-ranking soldier in all of France, a man named François de Bon, Duc de Lesdiguières. So I'm going to diverge into French history and geography for just a second. Lesdiguières was the Grand Constable of France. That's the highest rank in the French military, after the king. He was a hero of the French wars of religion, most notably the final war between the Protestant King Henry IV and his Italian in-laws and their Roman Catholic allies. Lesdiguières won a number of key battles and captured the Catholic South in the name of the king, hence why he was raised to Grand Constable. That put him essentially in the cabinet, or maybe the Privy Council of King Henry. He was basically the Secretary of War. And that made him very powerful, and to the king at least, even a little dangerous. Southern France was culturally and linguistically and even somewhat geographically removed from what you might call Parisian France. Lesdiguières, in that powerful role as constable, essentially became the governor of southern France, and should he decide to rebel against the king, it was unlikely he would lose. That might have something to do with why he was the last Grand Constable of France, and the power that he held was decentralized after his death. But after the war was over, Lesdiguières built a castle in southeastern France at the foot of the Alps that guarded the approaches from Italy. Should Italy ever think to invade, they would have to go through him. Now, his castle was near the city of Grenoble, in the province Dauphin. The primary geographic feature in Dauphin is the Rhône River, except for the Alps, of course. The Rhône carries all the river traffic from southeastern France into the Mediterranean, from places like Lake Geneva and Dijon and Lyon and Grenoble. All of that traffic traveled down the Rhône. The primary seaport in that region is Marseille, and while Marseille isn't actually on the Rhône itself, it's where all of that river traffic was going before heading out to sea. So Marseille was key to keeping that river traffic flowing. Now, Marseille wasn't in Dauphin, the seat of Lesdiguières. It was in the province to the south, Provence. Provence was Catholic. It had been a Catholic stronghold since the beginning of the French Wars of Religion, and it would continue to be so up until, and even after, the French Revolution and Napoleon. Now, there was a small independent enclave in Provence called Orange, because it was owned by the Prince of Orange-Nassau from the Netherlands, and that was Protestant. And, Marseille was a big cosmopolitan city and had a lot of Protestants living there, but by and large, the people and the local gentry in Provence were compromised. They were a little too Catholic in the eyes of Henry IV and Lesdiguières. So it was sort of implied that Lesdiguières was to keep an eye on Marseille and Provence and to make sure that there wasn't any trouble brewing. That's why he was where he was. He could watch the southeastern coast and the approaches from the Alps and guard them all should any trouble come up. And all that is to say that that's probably why he decided to bring in Simon Danziker. It would benefit Marseille to have someone like Simon Danziker around, and that would protect the shipping coming from not only his own lands, but the Duc de Lesdiguières' own shipping interests. In short, it was good for all of southern France to have someone like Simon Danziker on their side. So let's assume that Lesdiguières was behind bringing Danziker to France, and Henry IV merely signed off on that. Even then, the king's signature is important, which complicated Lesdiguières' plans. Because Henry IV was assassinated shortly after Simon Danziker came to Marseille. Now Louis XIII, his heir, took the throne, and Lesdiguières stayed out of politics, but he made it clear that his many, many troops were there to support the young Bourbon boy king. So that gave Danziker some leeway. Instead of being immediately thrust into the fold, Lesdiguières was busy dealing with other issues, so Danziker had time to spend with his wife and son. If he were, say, someone like Clint Eastwood, he would have had time to mend his ways and begin to build a loving relationship with his family. He would have had the opportunity to leave his life of wickedness behind and just be a fella. But the corrupting influence of society and progress would put itself directly in his path. And the only way to resolve that conflict was, as always, to return to his violent life and kill an awful lot of people. We'll talk about the plan of Lesdiguières involving Simon Danziker in just a moment, but right now, let's turn to John Ward. If we listen to William Lithgow, the Scottish adventurer and writer who gives us our last view of John Ward, the old pirate was just an old man, tending his incubators and his chickens. But if we believe contemporary reports from other European writers who weren't there to meet Ward personally, Ward was the pirate puppet master of the Mediterranean who controlled vast armadas of Barbary Corsairs from behind the scenes. If we look at the last couple of years of John Ward's life, he sailed for the Strait of Gibraltar with those other pirates out of Algiers. He headed for Salé with them. He was probably there when they took the fortress of Salé and held their first councils. And most of his ships, most of his captains, most of his pirate empire stayed there in Salé. But Ward himself, he left Salé. While Danziker and Sir Francis Verney were in Algiers, and then when Danziker was burning the fleet of Algiers, Ward was hiding out off the coast of Ireland with only a few ships. When he was spotted, and all England broke out into terror. Imagine hearing that. I'm not sure who fits here. Really nobody in our modern world fits here. But imagine walking down the street, passing a newsstand or a TV somewhere, and hearing that Adolf Hitler or Osama bin Laden was spotted at the head of 500 or so troops, maybe in Cuba. You know, that's only 500 troops, and that's 90 miles away from the coast. That's nothing. The Coast Guard could wipe that up in an afternoon. Maybe we would have to mobilize the National Guard in the area, but if you put Adolf Hitler at their head, suddenly this is imminent destruction. That's kind of what happened with John Ward here. There were tons and tons of pirates operating off the west coast of Ireland. There had been since before Grace O'Malley, and her ancestral fleet was still out there. But those Irish freedom fighters were more than happy to welcome in John Ward for two reasons. First of all, he was willing to fight and kill the English, and the Irish liked that in a sailor. Second, he was in the company of William Saxbridge and John Easton. If you recall, Saxbridge and Easton were two pirates from England who operated all around the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. They were in the Irish Sea and the English Channel up into the North Sea. They operated off the coasts of Spain and France and Italy and Barbary. They sailed out of Salé for a time, and they harassed Portuguese slavers off the coast of Africa. They operated in Newfoundland, over in the Western Hemisphere, and they sailed to the Caribbean more than a few times. Those two pirates, Saxbridge and Easton, were the pirates who sailed in and saved the Corsairs in Algiers from a Spanish blockade. And here, they were introducing John Ward to those Irish freedom fighters. But it appears that what John Ward was trying to do was to smuggle himself back into England. He did still have a wife there, after all, and maybe he wanted to die in his home country. But he was spotted, and England lost their collective minds. Well, he tried a couple of times, but eventually John Ward was forced to leave his home waters. Now, we don't know where he went. There were no records of Ward for some time until word does come up that he arrived back in his hometown of Tunis after the Dey changed hands and John Ward was no longer in exile. But what he did while history lost track of him is a question nobody knows the answer to. It's entirely possible that he saw the West Indies and raided the Spanish alongside Saxbridge and Easton. Those two pirates did go to the West Indies shortly after this little jaunt into the English Sea, and I like to think that John Ward was there. I like to imagine that his last true pirate expedition was in the paradise that would one day be home to so many generations of future pirates. There's something poetic and romantic and almost heartwarming about this pirate who would be the godfather of so many other pirates, seeing the Caribbean, seeing what would become so central to the world of pirates and piracy after his death. But in the end, Ward did return to Tunis, where he would eventually be laid to rest. But as for Danziker, his days of idle rest were coming to a close. The succession of Louis XIII had gone successfully, and Lesdiguières could return to his plans for this reformed, peaceful former pirate. He wanted Simon Danziker to return to the sea, not as a privateer, certainly not as a pirate, but as sort of an official naval officer is too strong a word, maybe an advisor. The merchants in Marseille were in an uproar over the Barbary Corsairs. Simon Danziker had been the admiral of the Algerian fleet, and we know that he hesitated in attacking Dutch ships. He was Dutch, after all. But it stands to reason that he might also have refrained from attacking French shipping. Any French shipping in the Mediterranean was coming from Marseille, and his wife and son and father-in-law lived in Marseille. So Danziker probably had it in his mind that he wanted to return to that city someday, if at all possible. Attacking ships out of Marseille would certainly make that a lot more difficult. And we really only have records of Danziker attacking English, Spanish, and Italian shipping. Now, though, Sir Francis Verney was running things in Algiers, and that pirate, an Englishman, had no compunction against attacking the French. So the merchants in Marseille were hurting. They petitioned their duke for aid. Now that wasn't Lesdiguières, but Lesdiguières got the petition eventually, and he wrote the young king, Louis XIII. But Louis XIII was still just a child. Lesdiguières, on the other hand, was arguably the most powerful man in France. So he wrote a letter that was, at face value, asking permission from the king to undertake a mission against the Barbary Corsairs. But it was really just a notice of intent. Lesdiguières was writing the king's council, telling them what he was going to do, and even giving them a few orders. They had to authorize a tax which Lesdiguières was already collecting from southern France. That was sort of illegal, but as long as the boy king signed off on it, no harm was done. Basically, Lesdiguières ordered them to get the boy king to sign a writ which, thoughtfully, Lesdiguières had already written up for him. Now that tax raised 24,000 crowns, and it was used to refit, equip, and supply 3 men of war to sail for Barbary. Those 3 men of war were placed under the overall command of Simon Danziker. Sort of. He was the admiral here, but that title had about a dozen asterisks after it. The captain of the flagship of this fleet was a seasoned admiral himself, and everything, all of the orders that Simon Danziker might make, went through him. This captain had the power of veto. He had the power to belay orders and to countermand orders given by Danziker. The presence of this captain with all of these powers made it clear that, yes, Simon, you are in command of the fleet, but should you decide to go back to your old piratical ways, we will put you in chains, put you below deck, and I, who am a very capable admiral myself, will see the job done. Additionally, Danziker had been required to leave his entire fortune in Marseille. Now, most of it was in the care of his wife, and under the close eyes of her father, the governor, but the rest of it, a not insubstantial portion, was left as a sort of deposit with the merchants there in Marseille. They would return it when Simon Danziker returned, or, should Simon Danziker die, they would give it back to his family. But should Simon Danziker turn pirate on this little venture, they would keep all of it to recoup their own losses. And then Simon Danziker wasn't even allowed to name his own officers. He wasn't even allowed to bring on his own sailors. The crew of these 3 vessels were French naval regulars. Only 3 of Danziker's old compatriots were allowed to sail alongside him. So Danziker found himself in a less than perfect situation, ordered to do a job under dubious circumstances without his old friends, and under pain of retribution from the king, or really from Danziker. The purpose of the fleet was to sail for the Barbary coast, specifically for Algiers, and they were to do everything in their power to hinder the pirates operating there. The expectation was that Danziker would use his knowledge of the Algiers Corsairs, he had been their admiral, and his experience as a pirate to seek the pirates out in all of their hideouts and all of their hidden coves. He would know where to hide and when to hide and how to strike, and when their guard was down, Danziker would pounce out and capture or kill every pirate he found. Danziker had the ability to send agents ashore with misinformation. He would tell them where to go and what to say, and that misinformation would lead the pirates into an ambush. And potentially, he might be able to get word to men who were still there in Algiers who weren't fond of the pirate life. He might be able to get them to switch sides, to leave Algiers behind and come into the open arms of France. Danziker swore to, quote, clear out those pirates' nests within a year, end quote, and he set sail on the 1st of October, 1610. Now, this was a French naval expedition. There should be extensive records of it. I'm talking about diary entries of the officers, a captain's log of daily events, and every encounter recounted in gritty detail. But there isn't. In fact, there's almost nothing. These were the early days of national navies. The French Navy wasn't even really a royal navy. This was a personal navy outfitted by the merchants of Marseille and funded by a tax from Danziker. So there aren't normal protocols in place. What's more, this is something of a clandestine mission, and neither Algiers nor Marseille knew anything about what was happening out there. Now, the French here, led by Simon Danziker, probably did some damage. They almost certainly did hunt down corsairs in their nests and root them out. But the first verifiable record we have of this voyage is when word began to creep back to Marseille that Simon Danziker had died. The reports were unconfirmed, but everyone assumed that it was true. Then, almost a year later, 3 ships sailed into Marseille harbor. Now, they weren't familiar ships, but when their crews announced themselves, it turned out that they were carrying the very same crews, including a very much alive Simon Danziker that had left a year ago. The ships in which they sailed were bigger, faster, and better armed than the men of war on which they'd left. From the description, it looks very much like the flagship they returned with was a Spanish galleon, which had been outfitted for piracy. The other 2 were, well, they might have been frigates in the Dutch design, but none of them had been stolen from the Spanish or Dutch, at least not by Danziker. They were taken from pirates who were now deceased. The mission had not been a failure. Simon Danziker and his ships had damaged Algerian piracy and weakened the pirates there. I wonder, and the timeline does sort of match up here, I wonder if Simon Danziker was responsible for the attack that left Sir Francis Verney without a fleet, the attack that left him severely weakened. Probably not. There are conflicting records to that effect, but there would be a certain poetry if that were the case. I mean, if this were a Western, couldn't you imagine Clint Eastwood, forced by the corrupt and vile sheriff to go hunt down his old gang, shooting down one of his old partners? He knew where their hideouts were, and he infiltrated them, only to shoot down his old partner, Yankee Frank Verney. And of course, Yankee Frank would be the charlatan, the con man of the old gang, the sort that wore glasses and read books and kept his suit clean whenever he could. Not the toughest nor the meanest in the gang, but with a silver tongue. And now he was out there leading his own posse, even if they were only the dregs of what had once been a respectable gang. That is, of course, until Clint Danziker came in and shot him down. Maybe Simon Eastwood? No, definitely Clint Danziker. And when Simon Danziker returned to Marseille, he was welcomed by his wife and his son and the whole community. Things were better off now for the merchants and the shipping interests in Marseille, and if they weren't still perfect, they chalked up their improvement in fortunes to the dancer. He spent 4 years at his home in Marseille with his family. His son, Simon Jr., was 8 in 1614, or maybe by this point he was 9. Simon Danziker the Elder was now something of a robust public figure in Marseille. His father-in-law, who was now deceased, had been the governor, and Danziker had dealings with the local merchants, the local count, the duke in the region, and the Duc de Lesdiguières, not to mention 2 kings. He was fabulously rich and famous all across Europe. In Marseille, they called him their, quote, most notable freebooter. And had it been left at that, he might have died peacefully years and years later. But it wasn't left at that. He still had his violent and notorious past looming over him, and that allowed the corrupting influence of progress to get its claws in him. And once that has you, it never really lets go. You can kill one corrupt sheriff, you can kill one roving gang of cattle rustlers, you can even kill the evil land baron, but there will always be another to take their place. The only way to escape that cycle is to ride off into the sunset, to go back into the wilderness, never to be seen again. But if you choose not to do that, if you stay in town, if you set down roots and you start a new family, there will always be another baron or sheriff. Imagine this was Unforgiven, and after Clint Eastwood killed the vile sheriff who everyone hated, he had decided to stay in town. What do you think would have happened? Well, more than likely, the federal marshal would have ridden into town to arrest him. Because you can't escape once they've got you. And this time it was, really, Simon Danziker's own violent nature that came back to haunt him. Much like Eastwood or Tommy Lee Jones or Logan or whichever anti-hero you choose to identify with, it was the ghosts of his past that proved to be his real enemy. And that ghost, in this instance, had a name. Jack Ward. Can't you just picture that gang sitting in some bullet-ridden farmhouse in the Mexican countryside, eating a meal of tamales and corn and grilled vegetables and beans and goat cheese and maybe the last of the wine? A meal that was prepared by a beautiful, matriarchal Mexican farm wife and her daughters, while her husband and all of her sons were out on the ranch getting gunned down by a gang of ruthless villains before they came for her. And there they are in the ruins of a once tidy farmhouse with the dead bodies piled up outside, drinking and laughing and feasting. And then a new gang member who was brought in for this job gets introduced around. We call ourselves the Corsairs. My name's Yankee Pete, and that there's Simon. We call him the Dancer, but nowheres he can hear, savvy. And that feller over yonder, that's Black Ward. Reckon you heard of him. I told you I've been watching a lot of westerns lately, all right? But Simon Danziker had already been pulled out of retirement once to deal with old Yankee Frank. But now, a few years later, Jack Ward's name came to his ears. There were 22 French ships, all out of Marseille, currently being held at La Goleta, in the mouth of the harbor of Tunis. By all reports, their goods had been sold off and their crews were being prepared for sale as well. The merchants of Marseille, out 22 ships and all of their goods and crews, officially petitioned the local duke and Simon Danziker to go and deal with this problem. And, if this were a western, it would be the blacksmith and the gunsmith and the cobbler and the shopkeeper and the saloon owner and the sign maker and the mortician and a bunch of ranchers. But in Marseille, we're not talking about the salt of the earth here. We're talking about landed and moneyed interests responsible for international trade out of southern France. We're talking about corporate power brokers. They could have taken their problems to Lesdiguières or even to the king if it had come to that. But Danziker agreed to help them without any of those higher-up officials getting involved, mostly because this wasn't going to be a military operation. See, the French had only just recently had a stroke of good luck in dealing with the pirates that were sailing out of Salé. They had agreed to cease hostilities and to return all French captives. We mentioned this last time, and these Marseille merchants thought that Tunis might be amenable to such a deal as well, and it couldn't hurt that Jack Ward was said to be behind all of these attacks. Jack Ward was, after all, old friends with Simon Danziker. This wasn't going to be a military operation, it was going to be a diplomatic mission. Simon Danziker was going to sail down there to meet with the head of the Janissary Corps in Tunis, a man named Yusuf Dey, and, more likely than not, he was going to deal with Jack Ward as well. Danziker was to see if a deal could be reached with Tunis. After all, they had a long history of friendship. At one point, Hayreddin Barbarossa himself had wintered in Toulon. It had been his home for several months. The people of southern France were friendly with the Ottoman Empire. In fact, the Franco-Ottoman alliance was still technically in place. The Dey of Tunis was putting that in danger. He was risking not only incurring the wrath of France, but of his own sultan. Plus, if that wasn't enough to sway him, friendship with Marseille could be beneficial for both parties. Favorable trade concessions could be agreed to, as well as certain military agreements. You know who France absolutely hated? Spain and Italy. They were the greatest enemies of France, except maybe England, but that was mostly in the past. Spain and Italy were for right now, and everyone knew that the Corsairs were also the eternal enemies of those two nations. This was the new world right here. This was society in progress showing itself. The Franco-Ottoman alliance was still a thing, but even more than that, Marseille was offering Tunis a chance to join in on a greater world coalition. The English, the Dutch, the French, and the Ottoman Empire, also the pirates operating out of Salé, they were all on some level friendly toward one another, operating against their mutual enemies of the Habsburgs, Spain, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. This was an opportunity for Tunis to become a part of that. Danziker got a messenger down to Tunis to see Yusuf Dey and to ask for a formal meeting, and the Dey seemed very receptive to this idea. So everything looked to be on the up and up. Everything was looking great. So Simon Danziker set sail in February 1615 on a course for Tunis. When he arrived, he sent a party ashore to inform Yusuf Dey that he had arrived, with only a single ship. This wasn't a military operation, this was old friends coming to discuss new partnerships. Those messengers sent ashore were treated well, and they returned with overtures of friendship from the Dey. The messengers informed Danziker that the Dey would visit him on board his vessel the next day. And when Yusuf Dey arrived, the next morning, he brought with him something Simon Danziker did not expect. Danziker expected the few attendants he had with him, and the scribe, and it's worth noting here that Jack Ward was not there. But what he brought with him that Simon Danziker did not expect wasn't nefarious. He had ordered the French vessels, all 22 of them, brought from La Goleta fortress into the harbor there. He had brought them out where Simon Danziker could see all of them. He brought them out to prove that they had not been damaged or sold, that their goods were still on board, and to inform all of the French and Simon Danziker that all of this trouble had just been a great misunderstanding. The Dey assured the French that he had no designs on their ships or their goods or themselves as slaves. He still held to that old Franco-Ottoman alliance after all, so he expressed friendship with Simon Danziker and the French officials. He even expressed a little bit of chagrin at having so many French ships in his harbor. But you know how these pirates are, though, right? Hard to keep in line. But of course you know, you were one of them. No offense. The Dey produced not only the ships, but also a ship's captain to ensure Danziker that no harm had been done to them. Their goods were still intact. They weren't being sold off or mistreated. They were given food and water and lodgings until all of this could be sorted out. So Simon Danziker was thrilled at this turn of events. So were the other French officials. They ordered that a feast be prepared there on the ship. They shared food and drink and good cheer with Yusuf Dey and his men until it was time for the Dey to retire for the evening. But the Dey arranged before leaving for a next meeting the following morning. This was, in part, so that the Dey wouldn't appear rude and could return the favor of a feast, but it was also so they could finalize and formalize their agreement and the return of all French goods. This was all in order and everything seemed fine. But imagine this scene in a Western. Imagine the old gunslinger meeting with the local land baron. The baron, a thorn in the side of the populace, brought the gunslinger into his parlor where they shared whiskey and cake and cigars. It turns out that the baron wanted to discuss an amicable end to the conflict, one that would see his interests not hurt, but also those of the populace seen to as well. He offered maybe money to the people and access to water and grazing land for the ranchers. Everything that the people could need while ensuring that his interests were met as well. So he might ask the gunslinger to return tomorrow when his lawyer would be present so that they could sit down and sign papers and make everything official. And then the gunslinger rides off into the sunset, and we would watch that from the expansive porch of the ranch house of the baron, perhaps from behind his head, panning over, around to see his face from the side, and then a black hat enters the frame. It's Blackjack Ward, old and grizzled. You reckon he bought it? I believe he did. He should present no undue problems. Your men ready for it? For him? No need to worry, Mr. Ward. Everything is proceeding accordingly. This would give us, the audience, a sign that everything was not right, but Simon Danziker, or the dancer, if you will, would have no notion that anything was untoward. Simon Danziker disembarked the next morning with only a dozen men. He was met by the same well-dressed officials that had feasted on his ship the day before. Danziker's men would have been mostly officials of one sort or another, not military men. But, of course, those well-dressed Tunisian officials did have an escort of flashy, brightly colored, bearded janissaries. They looked not unlike Yusuf Dey. The two parties exchanged pleasantries there at the dock, and then began a procession toward the palace. The officials, the scribes and such, pulled Simon Danziker aside to discuss a few minor questions of such insignificance that the Dey could not be bothered, and by that I'm talking about the money. These officials wanted to know just how much these French merchants were prepared to shell out to see their goods returned. How much was this treaty worth to them? The Dey was willing to be friendly, but these sort of negotiations implied that there would be a transfer of funds here. However, this was, of course, an uncouth sort of question, not the sort that someone like the Dey could broach himself. But these bean counters here would certainly want to hash out that sort of information before they got down to, actually signing this thing. Now, Danziker was the intermediary between the Marseille merchants and the Dey of Tunis. It would have been his job as their representative, and not to mention the richest man in Marseille with substantial interests himself, it would have been his job to judge these sort of discussions. So Simon Danziker and these bean counters were all up front at the head of the column with their heads together in discussion. Those janissaries were in the back with all of the French sailors who were taking in the sights of Tunis. As they neared the gates of the palace, that whole group stood back to admire the structure. See, this would have been their first visit to Tunis, many of them their first visit to Barbary. And, French castles were impressive fortifications, and French palaces, as they were now becoming, were works of art, but this, the palace at Tunis, was both. The defenses were woven in seamlessly with the arches and curves and mosaics for which North African architecture is known. This would have been a sight that the French sailors would have gaped at. The Janissaries would have been pointing out the more impressive details of the structure, but of course the Tunisian officials and Simon Danziker himself had seen the like of this many times, nothing to stop and gape at, so they continued on deep in their negotiation. And when they reached the portcullis, another pair of palace representatives appeared to guide Simon Danziker deeper into the palace. This was nothing to be alarmed at until the gate dropped behind Simon Danziker, separating him from his men. The new representatives led Danziker inside, while the Janissary warriors kept an eye on the Frenchmen still outside. They assured these French sailors that everything was fine and that they would be brought in shortly. So the French retinue waited for Danziker outside. They were confused by the situation and growing more and more tense by the moment. An hour passed, and then another. And then, atop the wall, a Janissary appeared. Trumpets blared at his appearance, drums beat, and the Janissary tossed something over the wall, something small and round, right toward the French soldiers. It landed at their feet, covered in red hair. It was made a deeper red than normal, though, from all of the blood. The French all stared in shock until it sunk in that this was indeed the head of their captain, the devil captain himself, Simon Danziker. At this point, when they looked around, the Janissary escort, who had been nothing but amenable this entire time, had their weapons out. They had the Frenchmen surrounded, but they didn't advance and they didn't attack. They told the French sailors that there would be no deal reached today. They took these sailors back to their ship, carrying Simon Danziker's head, and they told them to leave Tunis and Barbary immediately. Exactly what happened inside the palace is unclear. The accounts we have are from men who were not there. William Lithgow tells us that Danziker was dragged before Yusuf Dey. John Ward was not present, he says, and then Danziker was forced to his knees. Danziker was subjected to an hour-long tirade against him personally. Yusuf Dey lambasted him with accusations of the untold number of Muslim corsairs dead at his feet, and he wasn't wrong here. Danziker had betrayed the Pasha of Algiers, the man that he had sworn loyalty to. He had killed his own comrades in Algiers and then burned the fleet. That was terrible. But then he returned, more than a year later, to wage a guerrilla war against the Algerian corsairs. That was Algiers, of course, and this was Tunis, but apparently Yusuf Dey did not consider that justification. After listening to an hour of his sins being listed in detail, a Janissary warrior stepped forward and took Simon Danziker's head. Eventually, word would arrive in Marseille that the Tunisians would stop attacking French shipping. Word arrived that they would honor the Franco-Ottoman alliance, and it turned out that Algiers would even follow suit. But they would not return the ships or the captives taken. That was the payment of a debt owed by the French for harboring the devil captain. Much like Simon Danziker had used his knowledge of the pirates in Algiers to lure them into one ambush after another, it appears that John Ward and Yusuf Dey used their knowledge of Simon Danziker to lure him into an ambush. But the ambush was one of a personal nature. They wanted to punish Simon Danziker for his sins and not destroy the French alliance. The alliance there would mostly be upheld, even by the pirates, for a number of generations. And when it was eventually broken, it wasn't the pirates that broke it. It was the French, under command of Napoleon Bonaparte. Originally, my plan today had been to talk about pirate stories. about how the stories told about the Barbary pirates shaped the way that Europeans talked about piracy for generations to come. Instead, I talked about cowboy stories, so the discussion on pirate stories will have to wait, but I do want to talk for just a moment about the stories told about Simon Danziker. In the eyes of those in Europe, the Devil Captain fared better than his contemporaries had. John Ward had of course committed the ultimate sin. He had abandoned his faith in favor of Islam. He betrayed his family and his people, not just physically, but spiritually as well. In the eyes of those in Europe, John Ward was evil. Francis Verney was a shade less vile. He returned to Christianity at the end of his life, after all, and repented his sins. He had died clean, which is why his effects are on display in his ancestral home. But Danziker was kind of a hero. Yeah, he killed a lot of people in his violent, wild youth, but he settled down. He raised a family. He never converted to Islam in the first place. He had tried to become a man of peace. He was, of course, pushed back into a violent life, but this time it was in service of God and King, and corporate shipping interests. In the commentary of contemporary Europeans, Simon Danziker was kind of a classic Western hero. His wild, untamed way of life was dying out, but he would be able to put these tools, like heroes like Shane or John Wayne, he would be able to put those tools to use in defense of what was right and lawful and good. But I don't see him that way. I see Simon Danziker as Clint Eastwood. I see him as an anti-hero. I see Simon Danziker as someone running from his past. His demons are always at his heels, trying to drag him down, but he could stay ahead of them until he runs headlong into those forces of the modern world. Then he's forced to turn around and face his demons, not to shudder them away. And when he does, like so many of our greatest anti-heroes, the demons win. And that wraps up our tale, our version of Barbary piracy. Soon we're going to jump forward in time, several decades, to the 1680s and 1690s. We're going to be talking about the next era in our story of pirates and piracy. But not next time. Next time we're going to do something a little special. That will be our 100th episode. It will also be our end-of-the-year episode, and it will also be the first episode of what might be considered the story of the golden age of piracy. So we're going to take a look back. We're going to step back from our story as a whole and talk about everything up until now. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I'd also like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up as a patron on Patreon, everybody who has given us a review on iTunes or wherever it is you listen to the show, everyone who has recommended the show to your friends and family. Without all of you, I wouldn't be able to do this. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, I certainly suggest you do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com, or you can get in touch on Twitter, SoundCloud, or YouTube. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.